Hello, everybody, and thank you for tuning in to the Liberty Report. With me today is Daniel McAdams. He's our co-host. Daniel, good to see you.
How are you this morning, Dr. Paul?
Doing well, and ready and raring to go.
All right.
The Washington Post is helping us out.
Yes.
They have revealed some evidence that we think is worth repeating. The way they talk is there was a meeting, supposed to be a private meeting, last week. It involved Pompeo, and I guess the Washington Post was there. Or at least they got a recording. They have an audio of this. Mm-hmm. And the whole point of their reporting of this said that Pompeo was admitting that this optimism about the outcome in Venezuela is a complete fake news program, and that there's a lot of problems, and he was admitting on this tape that was a problem. It's interesting, he was meeting with some Jewish leaders, and I guess they're interested in world affairs too, but anyway, it came out of that meeting, but they got on the subject of Venezuela.
Yeah.
And this guy, of course, it's not brand new news because we never believed it was working very well anyway. But this is sort of a policy statement that they're admitting this, and there's not many people very optimistic. They said we still think it's going to be okay, but we have no idea when or really how they're lining up. I think one interesting thing he said was if they got rid of Maduro for some reason, they would have no trouble looking for candidates because there are already 40 lined up. I got to thinking they're almost like the Democratic Party. They're lined up to take over. So, but they don't know when he's leaving. The sanctions have been devastating, totally devastating to civilians and children. But most of the time that just, builds loyalty to their leaders because outsiders are coming in and doing this. And even though they're ruthless and criminal, it hasn't brought Maduro to his knees. And it's such a tragedy because things have gotten so bad in these last 2 years when these sanctions have been really hit hard. They literally have taken over the country because we control the finances.
Yeah.
We freeze their gold. We freeze everything, and they can't sell the oil. We essentially control their oil companies. And even if conditions were so bad and somebody woke up and said, this socialism we were doing wasn't such a good idea, maybe we ought to move in this other direction. So no, they don't even have that opportunity. And that I say mainly to make the point that solutions can be worked out without outside interference. And when we get involved and our CIA gets involved, as we have been for a good many years, saying that we know what's best for you, but what they're saying is we know where this oil should be controlled. And they believe that we have this obligation to control their oil, and they're an important country and they're wealthy countries. So we have, invested a lot, but I think the investment is for naught. I don't think that things are going to get better. People so often have pointed out how devastating the sanctions have been in Iraq. And we talked about the military and the sanctions. Iraq is not a better country.
Yeah.
And what was the cost? So all of this thing that we're doing, and they're weighing, the Pompeos of the world are weighing, well, should we use the military? Is there going to be a coup? And all these things. That is not revealed to us. But the revelation here, as I understand it, is that behind the scenes they're pulling their hair out and say, we haven't made any progress at all. And now what do? And of course, they don't have an answer because they're not listening to our program.
Yeah, that's right.
And they're saying, oh, that's a good idea. Maybe less is better instead of more militarism and more sanctions. Maybe shifting our gears and doing something else. But this whole idea that we know what's best, it's a presumption of knowledge that we don't have, because I don't think the purpose is to make the country better. It's the ability, our desire to control the country. I think that's what motivates our policy.
Yeah, and this leak, someone had a tape recorder on. I guess that's old-fashioned. They probably flipped on their iPhone. It reveals, and it's not really a shocker to those of us who follow it, but it reveals the huge gap between how the U.S. policy toward Venezuela is presented. to the American people and what they really think about it, what's really happening. You know, it undermines the entire, for example, the entire rationale for U.S. interventionism, because if you remember, it's sold as restoring democracy. We're restoring something that had been taken away, restoring a status quo. Well, in fact, that's not the case, because as he admits, we can't seem to get these people together. It's devilishly difficult to get these groups together. So they're not restoring anything. They're creating something out of whole cloth. And in fact, this whole idea that after the presidential elections in January, when the president was about to take office again for his second term, that we had to rush in there and restore, that's undermined by actually something else he said. And we have a tweet. Aaron Mate tweeted this part and highlighted a couple of parts that's very interesting. So this is not something new. Here's Pompeo. Confident Maduro would be forced out, but, quote, I can't tell you the timing. He said the difficulty of uniting the opposition has not only played out, quote, in public these last months, but since the day I became CIA director. This was something at the center of what President Trump was trying to do. We were trying to support various religious institutions to get the opposition together. And then he expressed regret that the coup failed. So this isn't some spontaneous reaction to a democratic crisis in Venezuela. This is a CIA overthrow operation from years ago when Pompeo was a CIA director.
But since it's done in the name of democracy, you have to see spontaneous support worldwide. And what was it? Within the day this was announced that was going on where Maduro has to go, all of a sudden there were 60 countries. Boy, they were knocking on our doors. We want to be first in line to sign up. And for some reason, people should question things like that, because what are they going to get? And they are going to get something. And maybe they will get a threat. Maybe they will say, well, if you don't do what we tell you, you could end up having sanctions thrown at you. And for this reason, it looks good. It looks like, wow, you know, if this were really true, 60 countries that say, hey, he's disrupting all of South and Central America. Well, for 60 countries in that area that don't like him and think he's a danger, don't you think they would have the ability to do something about it if they think they have to use force? Well, I mean, that is so much fake news, you know, to pretend that is important. That's just pure deception, and I'm sure they're the ones who won't be around if push comes to shove, because right now, just think of those military people that defected. There weren't a tremendous number, but there were some that came over. But they're sort of in no man's land because they're not going to be an officer in Guaido's army, and they don't know what to do. And I don't think Maduro. I bet Maduro might have their names on a list someplace.
They believe the neocon lies, and you know, these countries that rushed to recognize Guaido as the leader are now feeling indigestion. You may have seen this last week, Dr. Paul, but Brazil refused to receive the credentials of Guaido's designated ambassador. They said it was a technical thing, but so they're having second thoughts. The other thing that struck me about what Pompeo revealed that we already knew, but a lot of, I think, mainstream media consumers don't understand, that the opposition in Venezuela is not a monolith. It's always presented as everyone's united behind Guaido. This is an opposition. The interesting thing about what's happened in Venezuela, though, is that the U.S. has backed one of the most extreme and violent factions, and this is Leopoldo Lopez and Juan Guaido's party. They're the most extreme, radical of the opposition parties, and it really kind of reminds me of what we did in Ukraine, if you remember, when we backed these guys who all of a sudden started doing a bunch of Nazi salutes, you know. So it's backing the extremists, and there are other groups. We talked about the other day in the show, they're off to, was it Norway, to have negotiations. There are other groups that want to try to find a peaceful way out of this. But the U.S. says, no, only Guaido, this is it.
Do you think the American taxpayers might be subsidizing an assistant to Guaido? He is a special person who travels with him, but he happens to be an astrologer giving advice. But I wonder if he's on our payroll. Most likely, indirectly at least, he might be. And I don't know whether that has any significance whatsoever, but maybe it's a reflection of how serious this coup is all about, and who knows what's going on in there.
You know what he said? He was quoted, his astrologer said, I see in the stars that Trump will be reelected. but only if Maduro was overthrown. So
Yeah, so
that's a good
there you
one.
go.
So it's a couple of other things that were interesting about it is that it exposes the truth of the U.S. regime change. Remember, it was always sold, it's for the people, it's for the people. The people are going to do better. Venezuelan people, rise up, we're all for you, we really care about you. And when we hear when Pompeo says behind closed doors, it reveals how they really feel about the people. And this has been the same forever. You look in Libya, how the people are treated now. In Syria, if the jihadists would have won, how they would have been treated. In Iraq. So this fake concern for the people, it really is.
And even some of our allies at times in the anti-war movement are persuaded that if you don't want to go to war, what you do is you put on sanctions, even if they're killing sanctions. And it's interesting, this one article I just read was dealing with Iraq, which was the worst example of how bad they could be, because we used 2 decades in the 90s and on until we had the vicious war. But we had the war, which killed a lot of people. But their statement was those hundreds of thousands that died when the sanctions were on were greater than the people that died in the hot war.
Amazing.
So it's all evil, but it gives us support to our position that when you put on sanctions and boycott and steal what they have and prevent them from even trying to work out their problems, that is vicious. And it is an act of aggression. It's an act of war to do this. And it's the worst thing to do is people rationalize and say, yeah, that's true, but we have to do something. He's a bad dictator, and do something and make things worse. And there's no evidence that this usually ends up, as a solution. It ends up exposing, many people die, and then it ends up in a hot war and a lot of problems. And they have no control over it. This represents loss of control. They probably didn't have much control to begin with, because this was a manufactured, a coup. It wasn't something that the people just rose up, and that's one of the reasons why there's 40 people lined up. Boy, if we get rid of Maduro, I'm in line, because I'm going to be the president. So the chaos could get much worse if somebody actually gets rid of Maduro.
And that also suggests that these guys aren't interested in being elected. 40 people lining up saying, pick me, I'm president. Not I would like to run for it, I'd like to campaign for it.
Well, isn't that the way the CIA operates?
Yeah, exactly. You're the guy. The other thing, this is the era of Russiagate, where a presidency was almost brought down by just accusations that some members of his campaign team met with Russia-connected people, which is, of course, normal in every administration. We did it during the Cold War with the Chinese and the Russians. Campaigns did it, but almost brought down a president because he may have met with, some of his staff may have met with a Russian. This is the U.S. going so far beyond that it's so absurd. We're actually going in there and saying, okay, this guy and this guy are here. We've got to cobble you together. You're going to be the government. Can you imagine if Putin had done that? Okay, come in here, Trump. Here's going to be your guy,
I think it's worse now. In a way, you think the openness and the fact that we know about it and they talk about it, that should be better because they let us know. But it's almost like the people accept it. It's when somebody looks like they might be doing it to us, the Republicans and the Democrats have to get together and get to the bottom of this. But when we do it, it's morally accepted by the populace and it's by the media and the politicians and the Republicans and the Democrats. Well, this is different. This is different. These are bad guys, and you have to be unified. So you really haven't heard many speeches on the Senate floor or the House floor about how bad this is, but it isn't good. It's going to get worse, and this indicates that they're not right now. Their confidence is beginning to wane.
Yeah, and it makes you wonder because this really embarrasses the president. First of all, the neocons talking him into it in the first place with Bolton and Abrams and Pompeo talking him into it in the first place, and it's a disaster. And now it shows that his own Secretary of State, when the doors are closed, says this thing is a total fiasco, So it makes you wonder. And actually, I think it was in the Washington Post piece, he was joking with this group he spoke to that maybe he's going to be fired by tweet because the president likes to tweet out firings.
Well, maybe on the possibility of something good coming of this, maybe Trump will open his eyes and say, this Bolton, he's already complained about bad advice from Bolton. So he might say, this is really bad. We didn't know what was going on. But in this case, he should look at Pompeo too.
Yeah.
You know,
Keep looking. There's more. You got to get rid of them all.
Here, just think of the abuse that Trump got from Justice Department, the CIA, and the FBI, and yet he puts all his trust in these same people that were part of it. You know, and they were no better off than the people that were gunning for him and continue to gun for him.
And you know, I don't like to jump up and down and scream about prejudice or racism, but there was something else that kind of bothered me a little bit, and this is when Pompeo said, "Maduro doesn't trust Venezuelans one lick. I don't blame him. He shouldn't." That sounds, I mean, for someone who cares about the people of Venezuela, that's kind of a blanket statement about their national character, you know.
Yeah, and they said that's the reason they had to, Maduro had to trust the Cubans.
The Cubans, yeah. So anyway, this is a fiasco. Like all neocon regime change things are a fiasco. We can laugh and joke a little bit, and some people criticize us for laughing at times during the show. But it does get serious. As Dr. Paul pointed out, this article about the sanctions and how they're just destroying the country. And yeah, maybe their economic policy wasn't building things up, but these sanctions are designed to hurt people. If anything is a poster child for non-interventionism, here we have it yet once again. So hopefully people will start seeing through the propaganda.
Yes. I would like to re-emphasize something about the 60 countries theoretically that are supporting our position, the United States position, and supporting Guaido. If that were the case, you know, this could be settled. It's in their territory, it's in their neighborhood, and they should be dealing with it. But for us to assume that it's our responsibility because we are the most powerful, I think people fall for this. One person might say, well, it's a little bit closer to home than, you know, Iraq and all these other countries, which is true, it's a little bit closer. But Venezuela and Maduro is not a threat to us. I mean, the threat to us is the problems created by sanctions and the resentment directed toward us and the cost for all this and disturbing this. If we're looking for, you know, some settlement there, and we get in the way. It's sort of the kind of thing I point out about Korea. You know, if we had never stayed in Korea, I think those two sides would have gotten together, and I don't think it'd have been. I think it would have been more like the conclusion in Vietnam. And when there's problems in these countries, and when there's a system that fails, you know, the people will either reject it or they have to replace it with something. But this is a big contest, you know, on who's going to pick up the pieces. But we are the instigators right now. You know, they made a big deal and saying, oh, the Russians are leaving, and Maduro is going to be hurt because they have a advisory group there. But that is incidental compared to what we have been doing. This whole idea that we're out in the open, we admit it, and this is normal and correct, and never questioning the morality of it, the constitutionality, or the wisdom of it. There's three pretty good reasons why we shouldn't be there, and we ought to come home, not only from Venezuela, from just about every other place in the world where we don't need to be. I want to thank everybody for tuning in today to the Liberty Report. Please come back soon.